Wait, Skillich. Hello, my name is Marena, and I am a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes.
Ishkushku. Hello, my name is Isa, and I am a part of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska.
Throughout our lives, we have been told that as Indigenous students, we would have to work harder compared to our peers. Being Indigenous and a part of the seventh generation comes with a lot of pride, but it also comes with its challenges.
For those of you who don't know what the seventh generation principle is, it is based on Haudenosaunee philosophy that, in short, states that the decision we make today should contribute to a more sustainable world 7 generations or 140 years into the future.
Elders in the Indigenous community believe that the seventh generation, which is the youth right now, will bring the change that the world so desperately needs. Being a part of the seventh generation, I feel as though it is our duty to be the ones bringing change and awareness so that our relatives in the future will be better off than we are. Even though this principle usually surrounds energy, water, and natural resources, I think it can also apply to many other aspects of life. It applies to the work that Isa and I are doing today.
Indigenous Invisibility. This is a statement that few have heard of and even fewer have discussed. 4% of the world's population are tribal people, and we are among the most impoverished. For many Americans, we no longer exist. When a community is seen as invisible or extinct, it makes it easier for a dominant community to create their own narrative about us and how we are viewed. This invisibility makes it easier to create and support racist mascots and over-sexualized Halloween costumes. This invisibility contributes to bias and extremely harmful institutional racism.
Isa and I are trying to combat this form of oppression. This invisibility is clearly present in our education system and the world we live in. That is why we have started the process of trying to acquire land acknowledgement plaques for our schools.
A land acknowledgement is a recognition of the Indigenous people and the space they occupy. Most non-Indigenous people, and even some Indigenous individuals themselves, often fail to realize that every part of the United States is the homeland of an Indigenous nation. There is history here and everywhere. History that often goes ignored or unnoticed because our history is not enforced to discuss.
I recently read an excerpt of a quote by Anton Troyer, who is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University in Minnesota. To paraphrase, he said that he would find himself rude if he went to another country and didn't learn any of the history or the language of that country. He shared this as a metaphor for people today living on Indigenous land in the U.S. All people living on this land should at least know a little of its history.
Having more land acknowledgements would be a starting point for how the land should be seen and talked about. For those people that are not willing to research the land they are on in their free time, this would be a great way to create an environment that brings awareness.
We know that having these land acknowledgements is not going to magically change everything, and we definitely believe that actions are better than words and that these land acknowledgements are not only statements but are also commitments. We are asking our schools to commit to teaching about Indigenous communities in Wisconsin and beyond.
Before we go any further, we want to be clear with you all that a land acknowledgement is a first step and the least we can do in taking action towards decolonization and combating invisibility. It's simply the beginning of trying to acknowledge the original people and their connection to the land. It's a step towards anti-racism. Understanding the history of the land you're on is critical, because in doing so, you become more aware of why things in our current world are the way they are. And by becoming more aware, you aid in the fight against the ongoing process of colonization.
Let's talk more about colonialism, because in order to better understand the importance of why we're doing this, we need to be aware of what colonialism is and how it impacted our nation today. Colonialism is an extensive topic, so we'll keep it short. So in its most blatant definition, colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically.
I'd like to share with everyone a direct byproduct of colonization. Not surprisingly, colonialism exploits our education system. As a Native student, school, and specifically history, has never been my favorite. mostly because history is often written from the perspective of colonizers, which is to be expected as a byproduct of colonization as a whole. This is not to say that they don't mention the horrific and awful things that were done to Native people.
However, as bad as that sounds, there's still plenty to be discussed. And my question to you all is, why isn't this related back to our current society? Why is there no discussion happening for the Native communities still fighting to protect their land? The reason is, colonialism is still present today.
And furthermore, when the discussion of Native people was brought up, I remember feeling as if it was rushed, like it was something that was of less importance than the Industrial Revolution or whatever else they teach you in history. I, for one, am not a fan of things being rushed over, especially when they are relative to how things are now. From an Indigenous student's perspective, I personally believe we are not getting an education that actually reflects us.
To be blunt, the education system is failing Native people, and nobody seems to be actively trying to change that except for, well, Native people themselves. And you know, this is honestly sad, but we might be considered lucky that our state at least has passage of Act 31. In case you didn't know, Act 31 requires that all students in Wisconsin learn about the history, culture, and tribal sovereignty of Wisconsin's federally recognized tribes. And you know what? This sounds great and a big step in the right direction. So it's pretty disappointing to hear that Act 31 has its many flaws. First and foremost, there are no consequences for districts that don't follow the law. Second, the problem is not the teacher's education, but rather the curriculum's lack of credible sources that would properly reflect what Act 31 hopes to accomplish.
It's fair to say that at this point, with the lack of accuracy on Native American history, it's appropriate for one to start questioning what they are being taught. How can you not say that the curriculum in regards to these subjects needs a lot of work and should use Indigenous sources at the very least? Now that we've explained all that, it's no surprise that as Native students, we have felt invisible, and I'm sure many other Native students around the world would agree. I recognized this as early as 4th grade. If that wasn't frustrating enough, I often feel that I have to carry the burden of teaching my peers and teachers about Indigenous nations. I would like to make this very clear that I do believe this is damaging. It is unfair in so many ways. It is unfair that all of this responsibility has fallen on us. And take that any way you want, but there is no arguing many problems have fallen on youth.
Intergenerational trauma is real. It is deep and difficult to heal. Many people may not realize that a lot of history is still traumatic for Indigenous people today. Intergenerational trauma impacts our health, our connection to language and culture, our family relations, and so much more. This trauma has been passed down, and so when responsibility falls on Native youth, it can be emotionally exhausting for us to have that put on us. Intergenerational trauma impacts many Indigenous youth's mental health and is one of the reasons why the suicide rate is increasingly getting worse, and is the leading cause of death for Native youth.
Moving forward, we have to accept that role in educating others, because we know if we don't, no one else will. This is why Marena and I are trying to acquire land acknowledgement plaques for our schools. We want everyone matriculating from our high schools to know we reside on the traditional lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation. The goal for the future we are fighting for, and we hope to see in our lifetime, is a future that is rich with knowledge of all people and the land, instead of rich with oppression and greed.
This is a huge process, and we have been very careful in trying to do this in a good way, because part of crafting a land acknowledgement is getting permission to do so. If you ever want to do your own land acknowledgement in your community, first, you must know that you can't get caught up in doing it perfectly. Second, you must get permission from the tribal nation you are acknowledging and understand that you must do it according to how they want it done. There is no formula or outline for such a thing. You have to put in the work.
What makes a land acknowledgement good is that it comes from a genuine place. Something that frustrates us is knowing that people will give one just to check off a box. Please know that your intentions must be good and understand it's okay to make mistakes as long as you communicate with those you're acknowledging. This is one tool in the ongoing process of decolonizing yourself and others. We have to be engaged in long-term relationships with Indigenous communities and people. There is endless work to be done to make Native people more visible in mainstream ways.
Like we have said before, many people give a land acknowledgement and decide that they are done. So you may be asking, how can we continue to hold people accountable for their actions after they have made such a simple statement? And what are the next steps? Very valid and great question. Holding people accountable for any sort of work is crucial and can be difficult. That is why Indigenous people cannot be the only ones engaged.
We need everyone to be holding each other accountable. We can do this by checking in with everyone once in a while and ask what they are actively doing to continue the work of decolonizing themselves. People can also hold themselves accountable by reflection. One may ask themselves, am I still making an effort to learn? How am I supporting an Indigenous community? It is when we are thriving with accountability and commitment towards these communities that real change and healing takes place. So our question to you is, what actions will you take to begin the process of decolonization? Thank you.